Vivian Hartley grabbed the bracelet off the podium and threw it straight into her father's face. Not handed it. Threw it. In front of 200 investors, 3 city council members, and every camera in that ballroom. Richard Hartley didn't flinch. He just smiled the way powerful men smile when they think their children are making a mistake they'll regret. He was wrong. Because 20 minutes earlier, Vivian had fallen into that pool with a man her father spent 17 years trying to erase. A contractor. A single dad. A stranger until she saw the scar beside his eyebrow, grabbed his arm underwater, and gasped the 4 words that destroyed everything her family had built on silence. "I remember you." He didn't recognize her. That was the part that broke her open. Drop your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. What comes next will hit you somewhere deep. The night it happened, Vivian wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that pool. She had a speech to deliver. 43 slides. A $340 million waterfront development that had taken her 3 years to assemble. The kind of deal that made careers or ended them, depending on which side of the table you were sitting on. She had been standing near the east terrace of the Harrington Grand Hotel, a gin and tonic she hadn't touched, sweating in her hand, watching her PR director Marcus Webb work the room like he was born to it, which he probably was. Marcus could shake the right hands and say the right nothing in the right tone, and walk away with 3 new contracts before the appetizers came out. Vivian was not like Marcus. She worked. She studied. She prepared. While other executives at Hartley Development were playing golf at Kiowa Island, she was in her office at 7 in the morning reading zoning reports. While they took long lunches, she was meeting with city planners. She had earned every inch of her title CEO at 29, and she held on to it like someone who knew exactly how fast it could be taken away. That evening, the Harrington Grand was packed. 200 guests. Investors from 3 different states' city council members, real estate journalists, the kind of people who wore watches that cost more than a car, and checked them constantly to make sure you noticed. The charity event was a convenient wrapper, a benefit for the Charleston Children's Medical Fund, but everyone in the room understood the real purpose. This was the coming out party for the Harbor Light Project, Vivian's project. She had chosen every detail personally. The lighting, the catering, the placement of the architectural renderings on the back wall, dramatic and backlit a skyline she had spent years imagining. She was 20 minutes from the biggest announcement of her professional life. That was when she heard the argument. It started low, the kind of voices that are trying to stay controlled, but are failing, near the service corridor that ran behind the terrace. Vivian moved toward it out of instinct. She had trained herself over years to walk toward conflict rather than away from it. Problems didn't get smaller by being ignored. She had learned that lesson early. She came around the corner and found 2 men standing 3 feet apart in the narrow corridor. One was Derek Walsh, the hotel's operations manager. A thin, perpetually nervous man in a too-tight suit who was sweating through his collar. The other was someone she didn't recognize. Howe was tall. Built the way men get built from actual physical labor, not from gym memberships, wide shoulders that sat naturally, hands that were large and calloused, work boots still on his feet, even though everyone else in the building was in dress shoes or heels. He was wearing a gray contractor's shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. Dark hair slightly disheveled. A jaw that looked like it was made to stay clenched. Howe was holding a clipboard and pointing at something on the ceiling. "I'm telling you for the 3rd time," he said. "That junction box is pulling current from a damaged conduit. You've got exposed wiring 18 inches from the water surface. 18 inches. Derek, if a cable shifts, and it will shift because that bracket is cracked, you're going to have a live wire in a pool full of people. We've had 6 different contractors look at this system. Then 6 different contractors missed it, or they looked too fast because somebody told them to look fast. I'm not telling you it might be a problem. I'm telling you it is a problem, tonight. Our event begins in 20 minutes. I know when your event begins. That's why I'm standing here instead of outside in my truck. You need to move people away from the east side of the pool, minimum 30 feet. Or shut the whole thing down and let me fix it properly, which is going to take at least 2 hours." Derek's face had gone the color of old chalk. Shutting this event down is not an option. Do you understand what you're asking me to? I understand exactly what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to not kill anybody. Vivienne had heard enough. She stepped fully into the corridor. Both men turned. What's going on? Derek straightened immediately, relief flooding his face when he saw her. Ms. Hartley, this is Adrian Brooks. He's the electrical contractor we brought in to handle some lighting repairs. He's raising concerns about the poolside circuit, but our in-house team has already reviewed. My in-house team, Adrian said, not looking at Derek, looking at Vivienne. Signed off on this system 8 months ago without pulling the panel cover. I pulled the panel cover 40 minutes ago. What's underneath it is a different situation. Vivienne looked at him. He looked back at her. No deference. No softening of the message because she was who she was. Just the information delivered straight and flat. She felt a flicker of something irritation, she told herself, at the directness of it. How long to make it safe for tonight? If I can reroute the circuit and isolate the damaged section, 90 minutes. Maybe less if we don't have 90 minutes. Then the East Terrace has to be cleared. Vivienne's jaw tightened. Clearing the East Terrace meant moving guests away from the Harbor Light renderings. It meant disrupting the flow of an evening she had choreographed to the minute. It meant fielding questions she wasn't ready to answer yet. How certain are you? Certain enough to be standing here having this conversation instead of letting it go. She studied him for a moment. There was something in the way he held himself, not aggressive, not deferential, just immovable. Like a man who had made his peace with being the person who said the uncomfortable thing because no one else would. She didn't like it. Not because he was wrong. She wasn't sure yet if he was wrong. She didn't like it because the timing was catastrophically bad, and because some part of her had already decided that tonight could not go wrong, and this man was standing in the corridor telling her that it already had. Finish the repair, she said. Derek, have security keep guests to the west end of the terrace. Soft boundary. No announcements. Adrian started to say something else. She was already turning away. Ms. Hartley, you said 90 minutes. You have 45. Get it done. She walked back toward the terrace without looking back. She didn't see the expression on his face. 45 minutes wasn't enough. She knew that even as she said it, and she said it anyway, because the alternative was a 200-person event, dissolving into confused questions and rerouted cocktail hours, and the board of Hartley Development, watching her first major solo announcement unravel before a word was spoken. So she did what she had always done when the situation was bad and the options were worse. She moved forward. She delivered the opening remarks herself, smooth, confident, the voice she had built over years of forcing it into a shape that left no room for doubt. She watched the room respond the way rooms always responded when she was at her best. Leaning forward, nodding, reaching for cocktail napkins to write things down. She was 3 minutes from the architectural reveal when she heard the sound. It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing. It was a low metallic groan, like something straining at a joint that was never meant to hold this much weight, and then a crack sharp and short, and then a sound like something large falling fast through air. She turned toward the pool. The decorative light fixture, a large wrought iron piece suspended above the east end, had dropped. One bracket gone, the whole thing swinging down on its remaining cable like a pendulum. It caught the edge of the terrace railing and knocked loose a section that swung directly toward the small cluster of people who had drifted despite everything back toward the eastern edge, toward her. She didn't even have time to process what was happening. One moment she was standing at the presentation podium with a glass of water in her hand. The next something hit her from the side, hard, decisive, the weight of someone moving fast, and she was airborne. The pool hit her like a wall, cold, dark. The sound of the world cut off. Vivienne was not a swimmer. She had never been a swimmer. She had walked past pools for 20 years with the kind of casual avoidance that never drew attention, but never relented, always choosing the chair farthest from the water, always the first to suggest moving inside. Nobody who worked with her knew why. She barely remembered why herself, just a feeling. A pressure in her chest when the water got too close. A voice in the back of her mind that sounded like it was coming from somewhere very old and very frightened. The water swallowed her and the fear hit her like a second impact. Every rational thought she had, and Vivian Hartley ran on rational thought the way other people ran on oxygen went dark. What was left was pure screaming panic. She kicked. She grabbed at nothing. She felt herself going under and couldn't find which way was up. Then something caught her. An arm. Across her chest, firm but not rough. A hand gripping her shoulder, stabilizing her, pulling her toward the surface with a steadiness that made no sense given how fast everything had just happened. She broke the surface, gasping. "I've got you. I've got you." Vivian grabbed at him, instinctively, grabbed at his shirt, his arm, whatever her hands could find, and she was aware that she was making sounds she would be deeply embarrassed about later. Short, ragged sounds between each breath, the kind of sounds that didn't belong anywhere near the polished public version of herself. "Look at me." She couldn't. Her eyes were clenched shut, water running down her face, the sounds of the crowd above her coming through in strange broken fragments, shouting, someone saying, "Call someone," someone else saying, "Don't touch the water. Hey." His voice dropped, close to her ear, calm in a way that made no sense. "Look at me. You're safe. I won't let go." She opened her eyes. Hal was right there. Treading water effortlessly, his arms steady around her, already maneuvering both of them toward the pool steps with smooth, practiced kicks that spoke of someone who had been in the water before, not for recreation, but for something more serious. His face was very close to hers. She looked at him the way people look at faces when they are scared and searching for something solid to hold on to. And she saw it. The scar, small, crescent-shaped, just at the outside edge of his left eyebrow, old enough to be faded just white against his skin. And the world did something she could not explain. It folded, like a piece of paper being pressed flat after years of being crumpled. Something opened up inside her chest, some compartment she had sealed and filed away, and stopped thinking about so thoroughly that she'd convinced herself there was nothing in it. And she saw not a memory, more like a feeling with a shape dark water. Not this pool. Something different. Something deep and moving and very, very cold. A night. Rain. The sound of metal. And a face above her in the dark, young and terrified and absolutely refusing to let go. She grabbed his arm so hard her knuckles went white. "I remember you." Her voice came out strange, not the voice she used in boardrooms, or press conferences, or even in private arguments. Some older voice. Something from before she learned to keep everything contained. He looked at her. His expression did not change the way she expected it to. He didn't soften, didn't recognize her, didn't complete the sentence she felt humming in the air between them. He just held her steady in the water and said quietly with a kind of careful neutrality, "You're okay. Steps are right here. I've got you." And she realized with a cold that had nothing to do with the pool that he didn't know who she was. He didn't recognize her at all. The aftermath was what she would later describe to no one in her head as controlled chaos, with a very thin emphasis on the controlled part. Hotel staff materialized with towels and apologies. The operations manager Derek Walsh appeared at the pool's edge, looking like a man who was calculating how long his career had left. Several guests who had been standing near the east railing had minor cuts from the railing debris. The light fixture itself had landed partially in the pool, and the exposed wiring that Adrian Brooks had been trying to tell everyone about for the last hour was now very visibly, very catastrophically doing exactly what he said it would do. Though the circuit thankfully had tripped a breaker on impact and not electrified the water, Vivian stood wrapped in a white hotel towel. Her presentation destroyed her dress, ruined her carefully constructed evening in pieces around her, and listened to Derek Walsh try to explain to 3 different people at once what had happened, and watch the paramedics attend to a guest named Carolyn Oakes, who had twisted her ankle trying to move away from the railing, and kept her face the way she always kept her face, steady, controlled, giving nothing away. Until she found Adrian Brooks again. He was standing at the far edge of the terrace, also wrapped in a hotel towel, talking to 2 paramedics who were checking a cut on his forearm from the falling bracket. He was answering their questions with the same flat, unhurried tone he had used in the corridor an hour ago. Yes, there was a cracked bracket. No, he hadn't been able to reach it before the fixture came down. Yes, he was fine. She crossed the terrace toward him, He looked up when she was about 8 feet away. "Mr. Brooks." He waited. "I owe you an apology." Something moved in his eyes. He glanced at the paramedic who had apparently finished with him and stepped away tactfully. "You warned me," Vivian said. She was not a woman who apologized easily. She had worked on that, forced herself to learn it because she recognized it as a structural weakness in herself, not because it ever got comfortable. "You told me there was a problem. I didn't give you enough time to fix it. That was my decision, and it was the wrong one." He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody got seriously hurt." "Someone could have. Yeah." He folded this towel in his hands slowly, a kind of displacement activity, the movement of someone who was working out what he wanted to say. "Yeah, they could have. I had you almost removed from this event because your concern was inconvenient for my schedule." He met her eyes. "I know. I'm sorry." Another pause. Longer. She couldn't read him, which was unusual. Vivian had spent years learning to read people quickly, to identify what they needed from her, what they were afraid of, what they were about to ask. This man was not performing anything for her. He was just looking at her and thinking, and she had no idea what conclusion he was arriving at. "Accepted," he said finally. She waited for something else. Some softening. Some of the natural warmth that typically entered an interaction when one person had just pulled another person out of a swimming pool and the first person had apologized. It didn't come. "In the pool," she said and stopped. Something crossed his face. Very brief. "What you said to me. Are you all right?" His voice was different now. Not cold, but careful. "You went under hard. You should let the paramedics." "I'm fine." She paused. "You said, 'Look at me.' You said, 'I won't let go.'" He said nothing. "Have you ever said those words to someone before, in that exact order?" He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she started to think she'd miscalculated, that she was standing here soaking wet in the wreckage of her $340 million evening, asking a stranger about words he spoke in a swimming pool, and sounded as untethered as she felt. "Ms. Hartley," he said at last, and his voice was not unkind. "I think you should sit down and let someone check your head." "I think you're right," she said. "But I'm going to need to ask you something first." He waited. "When were you 17? Something stopped in his face. She watched it happen, the careful blankness of a man who had learned to hold very still when something caught him off guard. 17 years ago, she said quietly. "Was it you?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard all evening. He said nothing. She said nothing. Around them, hotel staff continued to move. Guests continued to cluster and talk. Derek Walsh continued his cascade of simultaneous apologies. The evening was in ruins. Her presentation had not been delivered. Her investors were standing around with unanswered questions and damp shoes from the general splash zone. She didn't care about any of it. She was watching Adrian Brooks stand perfectly still with a hotel towel in his hands, and the look of a man who was deciding something very carefully, and she was waiting for him to decide it. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." But his eyes said something else entirely. And Vivian Hartley, who had built her entire career on the precise science of knowing when a person was telling the truth, and when they were telling you what they had decided they needed you to hear, understood something in that moment. He knew. He knew exactly what she was talking about. And he was choosing deliberately, and with full awareness, not to acknowledge it. She didn't sleep that night. Back at the hotel suite that had been booked for the reception, now emptied of guests, the evening canceled, her PR team dispatched to do damage control with journalists and investors. Vivian sat at the desk in her damp hotel robe and opened her laptop. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Or she was sure, and she didn't want to say it plainly yet, because saying it plainly would make it real, and real things had consequences she wasn't ready to measure. She typed "flash flood bridge collapse. Charleston," and then stopped. That wasn't right. It wasn't Charleston. She had been very young, and the geography of her own history was blurry in the way that early childhood memory often is compressed, selective stored, more as feeling than as fact. She tried again. rural bridge flood, and added the year she thought it was, and then stopped again. There was a tightness in her chest that she recognized as the edge of something she had spent a long time walking around. She was not, as a general rule, someone who avoided hard things. She walked into difficult meetings. She delivered bad news in person. She had fired 3 senior executives in a single afternoon, once a thing that still made her stomach hurt to think about, because they needed to be fired, and waiting would not have made it more humane. But this was different. This was not a business problem. This was the feeling in her chest when water got too close, and the face of the boy who had been above her in the dark, and the fact that she had locked it away so completely, with such methodical, thorough intent, that she had convinced herself there was nothing to find. She remembered a car. She remembered her father's voice, very strange and very tight, and her mother not talking, and then her mother's door opening and closing. And then water, a sound, more than a sight, a massive rushing sound that came from everywhere at once, and then the world going sideways, and glass, and darkness, and cold. And then hands. A voice. The cold continued, but the dark receded. "Look at me. You're safe. I won't let go." The same words. The same cadence. She sat in front of her laptop for 3 hours. She typed things and deleted them. She opened county archives and found broken links. She tried 3 different regional newspaper databases before she found the Charleston Courier's Historical Archive, which had been partially digitized by a volunteer historical preservation society, and was organized in a way that suggested the volunteers had varying degrees of enthusiasm at different points in the project. At 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, she found it. A small article. Not front page. Local news page. 7. The kind of story that got covered because someone had to cover it, and was then forgotten by the following Thursday. Family rescued after flash flood sweeps vehicle from bridge. She read it once fast, the way she always read things the first time, scanning for structure, finding the load-bearing facts. Then she read it again slowly, the way she read things when they mattered. The Hartley family. Father, mother, daughter. A rural county road. A bridge over Mason Creek. A flash flood advisory that had been issued, but apparently not adequately communicated or heeded. The vehicle swept from the bridge. The mother and father extracted by professional rescue teams. The daughter, 11 years old, pulled from the submerged vehicle by a bystander before rescue units could reach her. The bystander was not named. Professional rescue personnel on scene commended for swift response. The bystander was not named. Vivian put her hand flat on the desk and breathed in through her nose slowly, the way she did when she was keeping herself very level. She ran 4 more searches over the following hour. The bridge, the creek, the flash flood advisory records, and then, operating on something more instinctive than evidence, something closer to a bone-deep certainty she couldn't have fully articulated. Adrian Brooks, electrical contractor, Charleston, South Carolina. I wasn't hard to find. He had a business, Brooks Electrical LLC, licensed, bonded, insured, 12 years in operation, BBB accredited. The website was clean and functional, not flashy. The kind of website a man builds because he needs one, rather than because he cares about his digital presence. There was a bio page, a photo, a younger version of the face she had been staring at across a pool terrace 2 hours ago. She looked at the photo for a long time. Then she looked at the date he had founded the company. 12 years ago. He would have been 22. Young to start a business. Young and apparently without the technical education those early years would have made possible. She went back to the newspaper archive. She searched differently now, not for the flood, but for what came after. She found it on a follow-up search. She almost didn't do a 2-paragraph item buried in a longer story about the aftermath of the flood season. A mention of a teenage boy from Crestwood Park, the trailer community on the south side of the county, the one that didn't exist anymore, who had been questioned in connection with a piece of jewelry reported missing by a local family following a roadside rescue. No charges filed. The family was not named. The boy was not named. But there was a detail. An age. 17. Vivian closed the laptop. She sat in the dark hotel room for a long time, listening to the air conditioning and the distant sound of the city outside the window, and the blood moving in her ears. At some point, she got up and walked to the window and stood looking out at the lights of Charleston, the city. She was in some sense trying to reshape with $340 million and a set of architectural renderings that were still propped against the wall of the ruined terrace downstairs, untouched. She thought about a bracelet, gold with a small sapphire. Her grandmother's. She had been wearing it the night of the flood. She had told her father afterward that she thought it had come off in the water, which was what she believed at the time. And then she thought about the day. Maybe 3 weeks later, when she had walked into her father's study to find him on the phone with someone she didn't know, speaking in a very quiet, controlled voice, and had seen something on the corner of his desk. The bracelet. She had been 11. She had been so relieved to see it had reached for it happy, and her father had ended the call and turned to her and placed the bracelet in her hand and said, "Don't mention where that came from." She had been 11. She had not understood what that meant. She understood now. She understood what it meant that a 17-year-old boy from a trailer park who had pulled a wealthy man's daughter from a flood and asked for nothing had been allowed to carry the rumor of theft for years because the man whose daughter he'd saved had found it easier to let the story drift in that direction than to complicate the official narrative of professional rescue teams and family gratitude. She understood what it meant that the article she'd found made no mention of a teenage boy. That the rescue had been officially attributed to professionals who arrived after the work was already done. She understood what it meant that Adrian Brooks had looked her in the eye an hour ago and said he didn't know what she was talking about. He knew. He had decided that knowing wasn't going to change anything. That being recognized, being acknowledged, being owed an apology by the daughter of the man who had quietly destroyed his reputation, that none of it was going to be useful. That it was safer to say, "I don't know what you're talking about." Vivian pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. She stayed there for a long time. She found his address from the business license filing. She drove herself, no driver, no assistant, no one from her office who would need to be briefed on why the CEO of Hartley Development was taking an unscheduled drive at 7 in the morning to a residential neighborhood on the east side with a printed newspaper article in her bag and the kind of expression she usually reserved for audits. The neighborhood was older. Not poor, not anymore at any rate, but modest. The kind of blocks where people had lived for 20 years and knew each other's cars. Small houses, good yards, the evidence of people who took care of things with their own hands. His house had a truck in the driveway. The same truck from the hotel parking lot she had clocked it when she drove in last night, because Vivian Hartley noticed trucks the way she noticed everything automatically cataloged filed. She sat in her car for longer than she wanted to admit. Then she got out and walked to the door and knocked. Silence for a moment. Then footsteps light quick, not the footsteps she was expecting. The door opened. A little girl looked up at her with wide, curious brown eyes. 7, maybe 8. Dark hair messy from sleep. Wearing pajamas with small yellow stars on them. Holding a piece of toast. Vivian had not prepared for a little girl. "Hi," the girl said. "Hi." She looked up from the child. Is Mr. Brooks home?" "Dad." The girl turned and shouted into the house with no preamble whatsoever, the pure, unself-conscious volume of a child who had not yet learned that adults modulated how loudly they called for each other. "There's a lady at the door." Vivian waited. Adrian Brooks appeared at the end of the hallway. He was in jeans and a plain white t-shirt, coffee in hand, and the expression on his face when he saw her was something she was going to spend a long time thinking about. It was not surprise. It was the opposite of surprise. It was the expression of a man who had expected something and was looking at the form it had taken. "Sophie." He put his hand on the girl's shoulder gently. "Go finish your breakfast." "Who is she?" "Sophie." The girl looked at Vivian for one more long assessing second, then disappeared into the kitchen with her toast. Adrian looked at Vivian. "It's early," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "I need to talk to you." "You could have called." "I didn't have your number. I have your business license address." His jaw shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite not one. "Come in," he said, and he stepped back from the door. She sat at his kitchen table, while Sophie finished her toast at the counter, determinedly pretending not to listen in the very obvious way that children pretend not to listen, and Adrian sat across from Vivian with his coffee and his careful, patient stillness. She put the printed article on the table between them. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. "You went looking," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I couldn't not." He was quiet. "You said last night you didn't know what I was talking about." "I know what I said last night." "Then let me ask you directly." She kept her voice level. She had to. If she let it slip out of level, she wasn't sure where it would go. "Were you on Mason Creek Bridge on the night of October 14th, 17 years ago?" The kitchen was quiet. The sound of Sophie crunching toast. A car passing outside. "Yes," Adrian Brooks said. "I was." The word landed in her chest the way she had known it would. "You pulled me out of that car." He said nothing. "I was 11. My family's car went off the bridge. You were swimming in the creek, I think. I couldn't figure out for years why there would have been someone there, but it was hot summer." His voice was quiet. Even. "Creek was the only water for about 6 miles. We used to swim there after dark sometimes when we were kids. I'd stayed late. Was about to head home when I heard the car go in." She had the strange experience of hearing a memory confirmed facts clicking into place with a solidity that was almost physical. She had not been certain. Some part of her had thought that the scar, the words, the feeling. Some part of her thought she might be wrong. Might be building a story out of coincidence and the desperate human need for things to have meaning. She had not been wrong. "They said the rescue team got us out," she said. "Rescue team got your parents out. You were in the back seat. By the time they got there, you'd been out of the car for about 4 minutes. A pause. "You were very scared of the water." The past tense landed with quiet precision. "Still am," she said. His eyes met hers. "I know," he said. "I noticed." The table between them felt both very large and very small. "The bracelet," she said. His expression changed not much, but she was watching for it. "My father had it," she said. "I saw it in his study. He told me not to mention where it came from. I was 11. I didn't understand what that meant. I understand now." The silence stretched. "I'm sorry," she said. I know those 2 words are not enough. I know what being suspected of something you didn't do costs a person. I know you lost a scholarship," he said. Not angry. Flat and precise, the way people state facts they have made their peace with on the outside and not quite on the inside. "Technical program over in Columbia, full ride. My mother had written letters for 2 years. There were 4 of us, and she was working doubles at a nursing home." He picked up his coffee. Set it down without drinking it. "When the rumor went around about the bracelet, the program director called to let me know the offer was being reconsidered. He was very polite about it. Said it wasn't an accusation, just that they had to be thoughtful about the character of their candidates." He met her eyes steadily. He used the word thoughtful. Vivian held his gaze. "That's why you said last night that you didn't know what I was talking about," she said. "One reason. What's the other?" He glanced toward the kitchen where Sophie had slid off her stool and was now standing in the doorway, trying very hard to look like she had arrived there for some completely unrelated purpose. "Sophie," he said without looking at her. "Backpack. School." "I don't have school today, it's—" "Sophie." She vanished. He looked back at Vivian. "The other reason," he said, "is that I don't know what you want from me, and I have learned over a long time to be careful about conversations where I'm not sure what someone wants from me." She had prepared for this. She had sat in the car for 20 minutes before coming to the door, thinking about what she would say to exactly this response. It all dissolved. "I don't know what I want from you," she said. "I know I owe you something I can't pay back. I know I want to try anyway. And I know you have every right to tell me to get back in my car and not come back." He looked at her for a long time. "What I don't want," he said quietly and clearly, "is to be a story you tell. Some version of the man who saved the CEO. Some press release about a forgotten hero." He let that land. "My daughter is 7. I've spent 3 years since her mother died building a life she can count on. I don't need cameras in that. I don't need to be repackaged. That's not why I'm here. Good. He stood up and picked up his coffee. Then we can talk about the Harborlight project. She looked up at him. Specifically, he said, we can talk about the fact that the affordable housing complex your development is going to demolish is where my mother lives, along with about 60 other families who were told 6 months ago they'd receive relocation assistance, that when you read the fine print amounts to about 40% of first and last month's rent in a market that your project is actively making more expensive. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. He looked at her from across the kitchen, with the steady, unhurried patience of a man who had been waiting to say this for longer than she'd been in his house. And Vivian Hartley understood with a clarity that hit her somewhere deep behind the sternum that this conversation, this man, this kitchen this morning was going to change everything. Whether she was ready for it or not. Adrian said it once clearly, the way he said most things without decoration and without apology. I don't want your money, Ms. Hartley. Vivian had come prepared. She had a number in her head, a significant number, the kind that could retire a small business's debt fund, a college education, change the shape of a life. She had spent the drive over telling herself it was fair. It was the right thing. It was the least she could do, which was an expression she had always found useful because it set the floor without specifying the ceiling. She had not come prepared for the way he said no, not defensive, not grateful. Not performing the careful, pained reluctance of someone who wanted to say yes, but needed to be talked into it. Just no. Flat and final, the way you'd close a door that had no business being open. I'm not trying to insult you, she said. I know you're not. I know what you're trying to do. He set his coffee down and looked at her directly. You're trying to make a number fix something that isn't a math problem, and I understand the impulse. But I pulled you out of that creek because you were drowning, not because I was running a tab. She sat with that. Outside, she heard Sophie in the hallway, the deliberate, exaggerated sounds of a child putting on a backpack with extreme slowness, buying herself as many seconds of proximity to the interesting conversation as possible. The scholarship, Vivian said. What about it? I want to. No. His voice didn't rise. It just got more definite. That was 17 years ago. I built something different. I'm not interested in going back and replaying it. You shouldn't have had to build something different. You had a path, and your father did what your father did. He picked up his coffee again. I'm not going to pretend that didn't cost me. It did. It cost my mother more than it cost me, honestly. She spent years defending me to people in this city, and she is not a woman who has energy to waste. He paused. But I didn't come here looking to collect. And I'm not going to start. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Why did you let me in this morning? He considered that. Because Sophie would have asked me about it for a week if I hadn't, he said. And then after a beat, and because I figured you weren't going to let it go anyway. I'm not. I know. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth exactly, but the absence of the careful distance he had been maintaining. You have the same look you had on the terrace last night, right before you told me I had 45 minutes. I was wrong about that. Yeah, you were. He didn't say it cruelly, just accurately. You're used to making decisions fast and having them stick. I understand that. But some things don't respond to that approach. She knew he wasn't talking only about the wiring. The Harborlight project, she said. Tell me what you actually know about the families in Crestwood Commons. She opened her mouth. Not the proposal language, he said. Not what your development team put in the executive summary. What do you actually know? The pause that followed was not comfortable. I know the demographic data, she said carefully. Average household income tenure, the relocation assistance package. 42% of 1 month's rent in a market that's gone up 31% since your company announced the project. He said it without inflection, the way you recite something you've had to recite before. My mother has lived in Unit 14C for 19 years. She is 67 years old. She works part-time at a pharmacy because her retirement didn't survive 2008. The relocation package you're offering her is $4,200 in a city where a studio apartment, not a one-bedroom studio, is running $2,100 a month. You do the math. She did the math. It was fast, and it was ugly. That's not... She stopped. Started again. The package was designed to... I know what it was designed to do. He met her eyes steadily. It was designed to look reasonable in a press release. The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Vivienne had read the Harbor Light proposal in its entirety. She had read it 3 times. She had asked questions in 2 different planning meetings, and the answers she got had been confident and detailed, and had apparently been carefully constructed to be both of those things without actually being complete. The relocation assistance had been presented as a generous provision. Nobody in those meetings had done the math the way Adrian just did it out loud in 30 seconds. Or they had, and they hadn't told her. She wasn't sure which was worse. I'm going to need to look at the full assessment, she said. You should have looked at it before you announced the project. You're right. She didn't flinch from it. I should have. He studied her for a moment like he was deciding something. Why are you here, Ms. Hartley, really? Not the apology. Not the money. Why are you sitting at my kitchen table? She thought about the various answers she had prepared in the car. The clean ones. The ones that sounded like the right kind of accountability without costing too much. She didn't use any of them. Because last night in that pool, she said, I wasn't thinking about the project. I wasn't thinking about the investors, or the speech, or the renderings on the wall. I was thinking about a boy who held me up in the dark and told me I was safe. She kept her voice level. It cost her something. And I spent 17 years not thinking about that, because I was busy building a life that didn't have room for things I couldn't resolve. And now I'm in your kitchen, and I don't know what to do with any of it, but I know I cannot sit in my office on the 42nd floor and write a check and call it even. I know that. The kitchen was very quiet. Sophie appeared in the doorway. Dad, I'm going to be late. I'll walk you out in 2 minutes. You said that 5 minutes ago. Sophie. She looked at Vivienne one more time with those wide, unnerving brown eyes, the look of a child who was absorbing everything and filing it away, and then she disappeared back into the hallway with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old who knows she has won a small tactical victory by simply existing. Adrian stood up. I have to take her to school. Of course. He picked up his keys from the counter. Then he turned back. The Crestwood Commons assessment, he said. The full one. The one your people actually ran, not the version in the proposal. I want to see it. All of it. The property valuations, the income displacement projections, the relocation cost comparison against current market rates. Vivienne looked at him. Why? Because I want to see if what I think is in it is actually in it. He held her gaze. And because if I'm going to have any kind of conversation with you about any of this, I need to know what I'm actually dealing with. She nodded slowly. I'll have it to you by tomorrow morning. Good. He moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, and I'm saying this as someone who has reasons not to say anything generous to you, you didn't have to come here this morning. Most people in your position wouldn't have. She picked up her bag. Most people in my position didn't fall into a pool with the man their father spent 17 years trying to erase. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. The ghost of one. No, he said. I guess they didn't. Chate. The full assessment arrived on her desk that afternoon, not from her development team, but from her own office, after she made 3 phone calls and used a tone of voice that her assistant Clara later described to a colleague as the quiet one that means it's not actually a request. Vivienne read it alone. No Marcus, no team. Just her the document and a glass of water she forgot to drink. By page 12 she understood why the proposal version had been edited. By page 23 she had written 14 notes in the margins, each one a question that should have been asked 9 months ago in a meeting she had attended by someone who worked for her. By page 31 she understood that the property valuations for Crestwood Commons and the 4 adjacent blocks had been systematically underestimated, not by accident. Not by the ordinary imprecision of real estate assessment, but with a pattern that was too consistent to be anything other than deliberate. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she called Marcus. "Tell me about the Crestwood assessment," she said when he picked up. A pause, short but present. "The one in the proposal I can pull the full one, Marcus." Another pause, longer. "There were a few different versions during the planning process, as you know, because the numbers shift as, I have the full assessment in front of me. Tell me about the property valuations." The silence on the other end of the line had a specific texture. She had been in enough hard conversations to recognize it. The silence of someone doing very fast calculations about how much they could still protect and how much had already been exposed. The valuation methodology was reviewed by the planning committee and approved at the Marcus. She kept her voice very even. "I am going to ask you this one time directly, and I want a direct answer. Were the Crestwood property values deliberately underestimated to reduce the required relocation payouts?" She could hear him breathing. "The methodology was aggressive," he said finally. "That's not what I asked. Vivian, that is not what I asked." The silence stretched until it broke. "There were internal discussions," he said carefully, "about how to structure the assessment in a way that would make the project's cost projections viable within the parameters the board had set." "The board." She kept the word flat. "Which members of the board? This really needs to be a conversation in person with legal present." "Was my father involved in those discussions?" The silence this time was the longest one yet. "You should talk to Richard," Marcus said. "Vivian, you should talk to your father." She ended the call. She sat at her desk and looked out the window at the Charleston skyline. The same skyline she had been looking at for 3 years, building toward this project. Planning this project, believing in this project, with the particular fervor of someone who needed to believe they were building something real. She thought about what Adrian had said. It was designed to look reasonable in a press release. She thought about 60 families. About an elderly woman in Unit 14C, who had lived in the same apartment for 19 years and was being offered $4,000 to disappear. She thought about her father's voice in the corridor of the Harrington Grand 12 years ago when she had just gotten her first real position at the company. In this business, Vivian, everyone loses something. The question is, who makes sure it isn't us? She had taken that as wisdom. She picked up the phone and called her father. Richard Hartley did not sound surprised to hear from her. "I wondered when you'd call," he said. He had a voice like polished mahogany, smooth and solid, and built to absorb impact without denting. "Rough night, wasn't it? Marcus tells me you had an accident at the reception." "I did. Heard it was a lighting issue. One of the contractors. The contractor warned us an hour before the fixture came down. The operations manager was told to ignore it because stopping the event would be inconvenient." "That's unfortunate." A pause. "Is that why you're calling?" "I'm calling about the Crestwood assessment." The tone of the room changed. She could hear it, the specific acoustic shift of a powerful man deciding to change gears. "That's a planning committee matter. If you have concerns about the methodology, you should bring them to. I've read the full assessment, Dad." Silence. "The property valuations are wrong," she said. "Not wrong in the way things go wrong when people make honest errors in complex calculations. Wrong in the way things go wrong when someone decides ahead of time what answer they need and works backwards. Vivian, I want to know who approved the final numbers. I want to know who made the call to present the condensed version to me in the planning meetings instead of the full document. And I want to know whether you knew." Her father's voice, when it came back, had dropped into the lower register he used when he was not arguing but issuing a correction. "You are looking at a complex situation through a very narrow frame," he said. "This project creates 400 construction jobs, Vivian. It creates 200 permanent positions. It generates property tax revenue that funds schools and roads and it displaces 60 families who can't afford to live anywhere nearby on the relocation package we're offering. Sacrifice is unavoidable in development. Every major project in this city's history has required. I'm not talking about history. I'm talking about Crestwood Commons. I'm talking about a 67-year-old woman in Unit 14C who has 19 years in that building and $4,000 to find somewhere else to go. Individual cases cannot drive policy at this scale. You knew about the bracelet. The shift was sudden enough that she felt it physically, her own heartbeat faster than she expected. She hadn't planned to say it yet. It had come out of the place where the things you've been carrying live before, you're ready to set them down. Her father said nothing. 17 years ago, she said. After the flood. You had it in your study. You told me not to mention where it came from. I was 11, and I didn't understand, and I let it go, and you let a 17-year-old boy spend years being suspected of stealing it, because it was more convenient than correcting the record. The silence on the line was a kind that she had never heard from him before. Not the strategic silence of a man calculating his position. Something older and less controlled. That was a long time ago, he said finally. His name is Adrian Brooks. He's 34 years old. He has a 7-year-old daughter. He has a contracting business he built from nothing after losing a scholarship because of a rumor we let stand. Her voice was steady. She had not expected it to be this steady. And his mother lives in Unit 14C of Crestwood Commons. The pause that followed was very long. How do you know all of this? Because I fell into a swimming pool with him last night and I finally remembered his face. She heard her father exhale a long, slow breath, the breath of a man rearranging a large number of things at once. Vivian. The mahogany voice was back, but softer now, careful now. What happened with that boy was complicated. There were reasons. I know the reasons. The reasons were that his background was inconvenient, and letting the story drift in a particular direction cost us nothing and cost him everything. You're talking about something that happened when you were a child. I'm talking about something that happened because of choices you made as an adult. She kept her voice level. She would not let it go somewhere that he could dismiss as emotion. I'm not calling to relitigate the past. I'm calling to tell you that I'm commissioning an independent review of the Crestwood assessment. Full audit. External firm. And until that review is complete, I'm freezing the project. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard her father produce. The board will not accept. I'm the CEO. I am the chairman of this board, Vivian, and I have spent 30 years. I know how long you've spent. I know what it cost other people. She picked up the original assessment from her desk. I'll call you when the audit firm is selected. She ended the call before he could respond. She sat at her desk for a moment with the phone in her hand and the assessment in front of her, and the view of Charleston out the window. Then she called her general counsel, a precise and unflappable woman named Diane Chen, and told her to find the best independent real estate audit firm in the state and get them on a call by end of day. Then she called her assistant and said, "Clear tomorrow morning. I'm going to Crestwood Commons." She drove herself again. She had been driving herself a lot lately, which was new. She had a driver. She had a perfectly good driver who was professional and discreet, and had never once asked her where she was going, or why she was going there at odd hours with a document folder under her arm, and the look of someone who had not slept particularly well. But driving herself meant no one in the passenger seat, no one on the other end of a phone call, no one to whom she had to present a coherent explanation of what she was doing or why. She parked outside Crestwood Commons at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. The complex was older, built in the 1970s, she knew from the assessment, which meant it had outlasted at least 3 waves of the city's development cycles by virtue of having owners who understood that aging but functional beat vacant and expensive in a neighborhood with actual people living in it. The buildings were 3 stories brick, well maintained in the particular way of things that are maintained by the people who live in them, rather than by a property management company. Window boxes, a freshly painted door on the corner unit, a carefully swept front walk. She stood outside for a moment feeling slightly idiotic, which was also new. Then a woman came out of the front entrance carrying 2 bags of groceries, moving carefully the way people move when they're managing a weight that's close to their limit. 60-something. Small, with Adrian's dark hair gone mostly silver, and Adrian's same quality of directness in her face, the look of a person who sized up situations fast and didn't waste time on ornament. Vivian moved without thinking. "Can I help you with those?" The woman stopped and looked at her with direct, evaluating eyes. "You're that developer," she said. Not an accusation, a fact. Vivian went still. I'm sorry. Hartley, I've seen your picture. She kept her eyes on Vivian. My son mentioned you might come by. Didn't say when. Didn't say much else. She considered for a moment, then held out one of the grocery bags. Take this one. It's got the canned goods. My building's this way. Vivian took the bag. They walked. He told you about me, Vivian said. He said a woman from his job came to the house. Said she was the one who fell in the pool. She pushed open a heavy door with practiced ease. Said she was also the one who didn't listen when he told her about the wiring problem. She glanced sideways. He mentioned both parts. That's fair. He's fair, my son. She started up the stairs. Sometimes annoyingly so. Her name was Gloria Brooks, and she had lived in apartment 14C for 19 years, and she knew every person in the building by name, and she made coffee without asking whether Vivian wanted any, which Vivian found she didn't mind at all. The apartment was small and carefully arranged. The apartment of a woman who had made peace long ago with not having more space than this, and had organized what she had with a thoroughness that made the smallness irrelevant. Plants on the windowsill. Books stacked with a system. Photographs on a shelf above the television. Young Gloria, older Gloria. A man Vivian didn't recognize Adrian at various ages, and Sophie at every age, simultaneously face after face after face. Gloria set a mug in front of her and sat down across the table. So, she said, what are you going to do about my building? Vivian had prepared for many versions of this conversation. She had not fully prepared for the version where the woman said it exactly that, plainly, exactly that fast, with a mug of coffee between them and 19 years of photographs on the shelf. I'm commissioning an independent audit of the project's property assessments, she said. Until that audit is complete, the development is frozen. Gloria looked at her steadily. My son said you might do that. He also said you might not. A pause. What made you decide? Because the numbers were wrong. Numbers in developments are often wrong. She wrapped both hands around her mug, usually in directions that are convenient for the developers. These were, I know. She looked at Vivian with eyes that had seen a long time pass and drawn reasonable conclusions from it. I know they were. I also know that knowing something is wrong and doing something about it are two different things, especially when doing something about it costs you. It's going to cost me, Vivian said. How much? She thought about the board. Her father's face on the other end of a phone call. The vote that was going to happen, whether she was ready for it or not. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Maybe everything. Gloria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the photographs on the shelf. She looked back at Vivian. My son was 17 years old, she said, when he pulled you out of that water. He was 17 and he didn't know how to swim particularly well, and the current in that creek was stronger than you'd think from looking at it. I didn't know he'd gone in until I read it in his face when he came home because he didn't tell me. Her voice was even, but only the way things are even when they've been made even on purpose. He had bruises on both arms from holding on to you and the doorframe at the same time. He had a cut on his head that he told me he got from a branch. Vivian looked at the scar in her memory, the crescent shape beside his eyebrow. I know, she said softly. He didn't want recognition. That wasn't why he told me. Eventually he told me because the rumor started, and it was easier to explain with the whole story. Gloria set down her mug. What hurt him wasn't being overlooked. It was being suspected. There is a difference. I know. Do you? She held Vivian's gaze with a steadiness that was absolute. My son is a good man, she said. He is a better man than most of the people who've had half what he's had to work against. And I need you to understand something, not because I'm asking you to be careful with him because he can take care of himself, but because I want you to be clear about what you're walking into. She leaned forward slightly. He has let people in exactly twice in his life. Once with Sophie's mother, God rest her. And he hasn't let anyone in since. Not really. He thinks he's protecting Sophie, which he is, but he's also protecting himself, and he has earned that right 50 times over. Vivian didn't look away. What are you telling me? She asked. I'm telling you that if you're here because you feel guilty, deal with the guilt somewhere else. If you're here because you feel something else. She picked up her mug again. Then be worth it, that's all. Just be worth it. The apartment was quiet. Traffic outside. Distant voices from another floor. Vivian thought about a number of things she could say, several of which were true, and one of which was the truest. I don't know what I feel, she said. I fell in a pool with him 2 days ago, and I've spent more of the last 48 hours thinking about him than I have about a project I've been building for 3 years. I don't know what that means, and I'm not going to tell you that I do. She met Gloria's eyes. What I know is that the families in this building deserve a fair accounting, and I'm going to make sure they get one. And what happens after that? She paused. I can't make promises I don't know how to keep. But I'm not here because I feel guilty. Gloria looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the coffee pot and refilled Vivian's mug. Good, she said. Drink that. And then I'm going to introduce you to Mrs. Patterson in 8B, who has lived here longer than I have, and who is going to ask you the same questions I just asked, except louder. And despite everything, the board meeting she was dreading, the audit, she had just commissioned, her father's voice still ringing in some back channel of her mind. Vivian Hartley picked up the mug and said, I'd like that. She spent 3 hours in Crestwood Commons that morning. No assistant. No PR team. No clipboard. She walked the halls with Gloria, who introduced her not as the CEO of Hartley Development, but as Adrian's person from the pool incident, which was not entirely accurate, but somehow communicated everything that needed to be communicated, because every person they stopped to talk to immediately had opinions about the pool incident and about Adrian, and about the development notice that had gone up in the lobby 4 months ago, and that nobody had received a straight answer about since. She met a retired school teacher who had taught in Charleston Public Schools for 31 years. She met a young couple both working 2 jobs who had been on the affordable housing waitlist for 3 years before getting their unit. She met Mrs. Patterson from 8B, who was 81 years old and had a voice like a fire alarm, and asked Vivian 6 questions in 4 minutes, each one more precise than the last, and who seemed deeply unimpressed by the answers which Vivian respected. She also met briefly a man named Roy Halliday, who ran the building's informal maintenance cooperative residence, who handled small repairs collectively, because the management company was slow, and because the habit of taking care of your own space was deeply embedded in this particular community. Roy shook her hand with the careful handshake of someone who was being polite because manners mattered, and not because he felt like being polite. The notice said relocation assistance, he said. I called the number on it twice. Both times it went to voicemail. Nobody called back. She wrote that down. She wrote a lot of things down. By the time she walked back to her car, she had 4 pages of notes and the specific concrete weight of a problem that had previously existed for her primarily as a line item in a proposal. She sat in the car and called her general counsel. The relocation package needs to be completely restructured, she said when Diane picked up. Get me a market rate analysis for every unit in the complex current market, not last year's numbers. And find out who owns the voicemail box on the relocation hotline, because nobody has been returning calls. Then she called Adrian. She had his number now. He had given it to her when she left that morning, with the tone of someone who was not entirely sure this was a good idea, but had decided to do it anyway. He picked up on the 3rd ring. You went to see my mother. She fed me coffee and introduced me to the building. A pause. How's Mrs. Patterson? Thorough. Something in his breath that might have been a laugh. Yeah, she is. Your mother told me about the bruises, Vivian said. On your arms, from the creek. The pause this time was different. She wasn't supposed to tell you that. She was informing me of relevant historical facts. That sounds like her version of it, yeah? His voice was quieter now. What are you doing, Vivian? It was the first time he had used her name. She noticed it and said nothing about it. I commissioned the audit, she said. Full independent review. I froze the project. And I just spent 3 hours in your mother's building talking to people who have been waiting 4 months for a phone call that never came. I know. I want to fix it. I know. A pause. What did your father say? He reminded me that sacrifice is unavoidable in development. What did you say? I told him I was freezing the project and I'd call him when the audit firm was selected. Silence. Then, he's going to go to the board. I know. They could remove you. I know. Another pause. Longer. Why are you telling me this? He asked. She thought about the various diplomatic framings of the honest answer and set them all aside. Because you're the only person I've talked to in the last 2 days who has told me what was actually true, and I find I want to keep doing that. She paused. And because I think the things that are about to happen are going to be loud and public, and I wanted you to know before they get loud what I actually did and why. She heard him breathe. Sophie has a school thing Thursday, he said finally. A science exhibition. She built a working model of a water filtration system, which is either very relevant to this situation or a massive coincidence. A pause. She asked if you were coming. Vivian felt something move in her chest that had no professional category. Why would she ask that? Because she asked me if you were a good person, he said, and I told her I was still figuring it out. And she said, well, maybe she should come to the science thing and we can figure it out together. Vivian looked out the windshield at the front entrance of Crestwood Commons, where Mrs. Patterson had appeared, and was watering a pot of geraniums by the door, with the focused intensity of someone who took geraniums very seriously. She's 7, Vivian said. She's her mother's daughter, Adrian said. She figures people out fast. And you, she said. Are you figuring it out? A long pause. Thursday, he said. 7 p.m. James Island Elementary. Then he hung up. Vivian sat in the car for a moment longer watching Mrs. Patterson water her geraniums in the warm Charleston morning. Then she started the car. She had an audit to oversee, a board to prepare for, and a project she had spent 3 years building that she was now voluntarily taking apart at the seams. And she found to her own considerable surprise that her hands on the steering wheel were completely steady. The audit results came back in 11 days. 11 days was fast. Diane Chen had made that clear when she hired the firm Fast Thorough and with no prior relationship to Hartley Development or any of its subsidiaries. The firm had sent 4 people. They worked through a weekend. When Diane called Vivian on a Thursday morning and said, "You need to come in and sit down before I send you the file," Vivian understood that Fast had been the right call. She sat down. She read the file. It was worse than she had thought, and she had spent 11 days thinking it was bad. The property valuations for Crestwood Commons and the 3 adjacent residential blocks had been deliberately suppressed by an average of 38% below current market rate. Not through imprecise methodology or optimistic projection, through a coordinated series of assessment decisions that the audit firm described in the careful language of people who understood the legal weight of their words as systematically inconsistent with standard practice in a pattern that suggests intentional structuring. The relocation assistance package calculated against those suppressed values was not 40% of 1 month's market rent. It was in real terms closer to 22% of what families would need to secure comparable housing within a 15-mile radius of the development site. There were internal communications. Emails between 2 of her senior vice presidents and a planning consultant. The company had retained referencing value targets and acceptable displacement costs in language that made Vivian's jaw tighten in a way she could feel in her back teeth. And there, in 3 separate email chains from 14 months ago, was her father's name. Not directing, not in the emails themselves, but CC'd, present, informed. She looked at those 3 instances of Richard Hartley for a long time. Then she called Diane back. How actionable is this? Very, Diane said. The question is what direction you want to go. I want to go in the direction of the truth. A pause. That direction has consequences, Vivian. I know. The board meeting is in 4 days. Your father has been making calls. I've heard from 3 directors in the last 48 hours who are what? Concerned, Diane said carefully. About leadership stability. About the project freeze, about what they're describing as unilateral decision-making. Vivian translated that without difficulty. Her father had spent 4 days working the room, and the room had been receptive. "Set up a meeting with the full board," she said. "Before the scheduled session, day after tomorrow." "Vivian." "All of them, not a call, in person. I'll present the audit findings myself." After she hung up, she sat in her office for a long time, looking at the audit file and listening to the city outside the window and thinking about her father's voice. In this business, everyone loses something. The question is, who makes sure it isn't us? She had taken that as wisdom. She understood now that it was a policy. She called Adrian that evening. He picked up on the second ring, and she could hear Sophie in the background. Something about a poster board and whether purple or green was more scientifically accurate for water molecules. A debate that seemed to be ongoing and unresolved. Bad time. "It's fine, Sophie Green. Water molecules are not purple." A pause. "She says purple is more eye-catching." "She's not wrong. Don't tell her that." His voice shifted slightly, the small acoustic adjustment of a man stepping into a different room. The audit came back. Yes. And, she told him, not everything. Not the full technical language of the report, but the real numbers, the real gap, the real pattern. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. 38%, he said. Average. My mother's unit, 41. She heard him exhale, not surprised. The exhale of someone who had known a thing was true and was now holding the confirmed weight of it. What are you going to do? I'm presenting the findings to the full board in 2 days. I'm recommending we cancel the original development plan entirely and restructure from the ground up with independent community oversight. And your father. He'll be there. Vivian. His voice was careful. He's going to fight you. I know. In front of the full board, with everything he has. I know. And the emails with his name on them are part of the presentation. A longer silence. You understand what you're doing, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm a little terrified, she said, but yes, I understand what I'm doing. She had not planned to say the first part. It came out because it was true, and because he was the only person she had told true things to consistently for the past 2 weeks, and her mouth had apparently decided to continue the pattern without consulting the rest of her. Good, he said. You should be a little terrified. It means you understand the stakes. That is the least comforting thing anyone has said to me today. I'm not trying to comfort you. A pause. I'm trying to tell you it's the right call. She felt something in her chest settle slightly. Not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes when someone you trust tells you that the hard thing you're about to do is actually the hard thing you're supposed to do. Sophie's exhibition is tomorrow night, he said. I know. You don't have to. I said I'd come. A beat of quiet. Okay, he said. 7 o'clock. Bring a preference on purple versus green, because she is going to ask. James Island Elementary, at 7 in the evening, had the specific energy of a place that was trying to be a formal event and was a school gymnasium, and the tension between those two facts was charming, in a way that Vivian had not expected to find charming. She wore jeans. She had deliberated about this for longer than she would admit. She owned approximately 4 pairs of jeans that had never been worn to anything that could be described as casual, and she had stood in her closet for 10 minutes before selecting them on the theory that showing up to a 7-year-old science exhibition in a blazer was a choice that said something about her that she didn't want said. Sophie found her before she found them. You came. She appeared at Vivian's elbow with the sudden materialization of a child who had been watching the door. Dad said you might not because you have a lot of work. I do have a lot of work. I came anyway. Sophie assessed this. Okay, come see my project. It's the best one. I'm not supposed to say that, but it's true. She grabbed Vivian's hand with the complete absence of self-consciousness that Vivian associated almost exclusively with Sophie and with nobody else she had met in her adult life, and pulled her toward the far end of the gymnasium. Adrian was standing beside Sophie's table, talking to another parent, a broad-shouldered man in a Clemson sweatshirt who appeared to be asking very earnest questions about water filtration. He looked up when Vivian approached. Something in his face did the thing it sometimes did, now that small, almost imperceptible adjustment that she had started watching for and trying not to watch for both. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Sophie launched into her presentation with the energy of someone who had been rehearsing and was very ready for an audience. The model was genuinely impressive. Layers of gravel sand, activated charcoal, each one labeled in handwriting that was large and slightly uneven and completely confident. She walked Vivian through the filtration process with the focused intensity of a scientist who had not yet learned to underestimate her own work. "The dirty water goes in here," Sophie said, pointing to the top chamber, "and gravity pulls it down through all the layers, and each layer takes out different things, and by the time it comes out, the bottom it's clean. It doesn't need anything from outside. It just needs the right layers in the right order." She looked up at Vivian. "My teacher said it's a good metaphor," she said with the tone of someone who was still deciding whether metaphors were worth the effort. "I said I just thought it was cool that it works." Vivian looked at the model. She looked at Sophie. "Both can be true," she said. Sophie considered this with great seriousness. "Yeah," she decided. "Okay, is it green or purple for the water molecules?" "Green," Vivian said. "Scientifically. But purple is more eye-catching." Sophie turned to her father with an expression of profound vindication. "I told you." Afterward, the three of them walked to a diner 2 blocks from the school. Sophie's choice, also apparently non-negotiable, and sat in a vinyl booth while Sophie ordered a grilled cheese and a chocolate milkshake and narrated the comparative failures of every other science project in the gymnasium with a precision that was, Vivian thought, extremely Adrian. At some point, Sophie fell quiet, and Vivian looked down to find her asleep against Adrian's arm, her head at the specific tilted angle of a child who has made an executive decision to be unconscious and has committed to it fully. Adrian didn't move to disturb her. He held very still the way parents learn to hold still. "She does this," he said quietly. "Goes from 100 to 0. She's wonderful." He looked at Sophie's face and said nothing. But the nothing was very full. "How are you doing with the board meeting?" he said after a moment. "I'm ready." A pause. "I think I'm ready. I've been ready for things before that turned out to be different when I was standing in the middle of them. What's the worst case? They remove me, reinstate my father's authority over the project. The development proceeds on the original plan. And your company survives without me, probably." She looked at her coffee. "The project is profitable. That's always been true. The question is what it costs the people who aren't on the profit side of it. What happens to you?" She looked up. He was watching her steadily, Sophie asleep against his arm. "I'll be fine," she said. "I have savings. I have a reputation, whatever it's worth after this. I'll rebuild something." She paused. "I've done it before. You haven't done it after going up against your own father in front of a board of directors." No, she said. "That's new." He looked at her for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "That night in the pool, when you were going under." He was quiet for a second. "You grabbed at nothing. You couldn't find which way was up, and then you found it." He looked at Sophie. "You didn't find it because someone handed it to you. You found it because you stopped fighting the wrong direction and just let yourself rise." She didn't say anything. "That's not advice," he said. "I'm not trying to give you advice. I just keep thinking about it." "I know," she said. "I keep thinking about it too." The diner was quiet around them. Outside Charleston at night, warm and ordinary and indifferent. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens in that board meeting." She held his gaze. "I need you to know that I'm not doing it to pay a debt. I'm not doing it because I feel guilty or because I want something from you or because I'm building a narrative about redemption that ends with a press release." She paused. "I'm doing it because it's right. And because I looked at 60 families in that building, and I looked at your mother's face, and I looked at those audit numbers, and I understood something that I should have understood 3 years ago. I was very still." "I'm telling you," she said, "because you asked me once what I actually wanted, and I didn't have a clean answer. I still don't. but I know what I'm not doing, and I thought you deserved to hear that." He looked at her for a long time. "Okay," he said, "just that." But the way he said it was different from all the other times he had said, "Okay," which had been careful and considered and held at a measured distance. This "okay" sat differently. Like something that had been standing just inside a doorway had decided to come the rest of the way in. She drove home alone, and she sat at her desk until 2 in the morning, reviewing the board presentation, and she did not once second-guess the decision she had made. The board meeting was held at the Hartley Development offices on the 28th floor in the conference room, with the long mahogany table and the view of the harbor that had always been intended to remind everyone present of exactly what kind of company this was and exactly what was at stake. Vivian had been in this room for 100 meetings. She had never walked into it the way she walked into it now. There were 11 directors. 9 were in person. 2 were on a screen at the far end of the table. Her father was already seated when she arrived at the far end of the table from her chair, with the stillness of a man who had been in the room long enough to own it before the meeting started. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She sat down and opened her laptop and said, "Thank you all for making time for this. I want to walk through the independent audit findings and then make a recommendation. I'll take questions at the end." She presented for 40 minutes. She did not soften the numbers. She did not contextualize the emails with the kind of careful framing that was designed to make uncomfortable facts feel like part of a larger picture that was ultimately reasonable. She showed the suppressed valuations. She showed the gap between what was promised and what families would actually receive. She showed the pattern. She showed the emails. When she showed the emails with her father's name CC'd in 3 separate threads, she did not pause for effect. She did not look at him. She stated what the documents showed and moved to the next slide. The room was very quiet. When she was done, she said, "My recommendation is that we suspend the Harbor Light project in its current form, commission a full redesign with independent community oversight and binding protections for current residents, and retain outside counsel to review the conduct of the planning committee." She closed the laptop. Questions. It was not a question. It was an opening of a door. Director Elaine Marsh, who had been on the board for 7 years, and who Vivian had always found direct and worth listening to, said, "If we proceed with the independent redesign, what's the timeline impact?" 18 months minimum, possibly 24. Revenue impact, significant in the short term. Reduced in the long term, because the redesign will incorporate mixed-income housing that qualifies for federal development incentives the current plan doesn't access. She had done that math. It was in the supplemental document. We lose the fast money. We keep the company's ability to operate in this city for the next 20 years without a federal housing discrimination investigation. Elaine Marsh wrote something down. Then Richard Hartley spoke. His voice when it came was exactly what she had expected. The mahogany smoothness, the total control, the tone of a man who was managing a situation that was regrettable but ultimately correctable. "I appreciate the thoroughness of this presentation," he said. "And I want to address the emails that were referenced." He looked around the table with calm authority. Being copied on communications does not constitute approval or direction. In an organization of this size, I receive hundreds of emails weekly. The planning committee made independent decisions within their authority, and while the audit has identified areas for improvement in our assessment methodology, describing this as "Dad." Her voice was quiet. He stopped. Everyone in the room heard what it meant that she had called him that, not Mr. Chairman, not Richard, but Dad, in that particular tone, in that particular room. "I'm not going to debate the emails," she said. "I'm going to tell this board something that isn't in the audit report because it's relevant to the question of whether the culture that produced these assessment decisions is an anomaly or a pattern." She reached into the folder in front of her. She put the bracelet on the table. Small. Gold. A tiny sapphire that caught the conference room light. 17 years ago, she said. My family's car was swept from a bridge during a flash flood. A 17-year-old boy from a working-class family pulled me out of a submerged vehicle before rescue teams arrived. He was never publicly credited. Instead, when a piece of jewelry went missing in the chaos, My father allowed that boy's reputation to be shadowed by a theft rumor rather than correct the record, because correcting the record would have complicated the story he preferred. She looked around the table. That boy's name is Adrian Brooks. He lost a technical scholarship because of that rumor. He is now a 34-year-old electrical contractor whose mother lives in Unit 14C of Crestwood Commons. He was also the contractor who warned our hotel operations manager about unsafe wiring 1 hour before a lighting fixture came down at our reception and was told to finish the job quietly and stay out of the way. The room was so quiet she could hear the harbor. I'm not telling you this to make a personal point, she said. I'm telling you because the same decision-making process that silenced a 17-year-old boy to protect a convenient story is the same process that suppressed property valuations to protect a profitable development. It is the same process that told a contractor his safety concerns were inconvenient. It is not a planning committee problem. It is a culture, and it started at the top of this organization. She looked at her father for the first time since she had begun. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, something older than anger. I am asking this board, she said, to hold this company to a different standard. Not because it's the right story to tell, because it's the right thing to do. She sat back. Director Marsh said after a moment, I'd like to move the audit findings to a formal review. 3 other directors seconded before she had finished the sentence. Her father said, I'd like to call for a leadership review. Seconded, said one director. Then silence. The other 9 said nothing. We'll vote, said the board chair Warren Holt, who had been listening without speaking for the entire meeting, and who now looked like a man who had been required to make a decision he had not expected to make today. The leadership review will require a majority. Let's take a 10-minute recess. Vivian picked up the bracelet and put it in her pocket and walked to the window. She looked at the harbor. She breathed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Adrian. How are you doing? Not a question mark. A statement. The particular grammar of someone who already knew the answer might not be clean. She typed back, still standing. A pause. Then, that's enough. She put the phone in her pocket. Behind her she heard the directors returning to the table. She heard Warren Holt's voice, steady and deliberate, beginning the process of calling the vote. She turned around. She walked back to her chair. She sat down. And Vivian Hartley, who had built her entire career on the science of knowing when she had won before the numbers were final, felt something she could not calculate, and could not control, and could not schedule into a slide deck. The specific vertiginous feeling of a person who has done the right thing and does not yet know what it will cost, and has decided that the cost is beside the point. Warren Holt said, We'll begin with the motion for leadership review proposed by Director Hartley. All in favor. 2 hands went up. Her father's, and 1 other. Warren looked around the table. Let the count sit. Then, motion fails. We'll proceed to the motion on the independent audit review and project redesign recommendation. 7 hands. Then 8. Then Elaine Marsh, who had been writing something down for the last 4 minutes, raised hers last and said without looking up, And I'd like to formally recommend we also review the conduct of the planning committee, including all communications before the next session. Seconded, said 3 people at once. Warren nodded, wrote something down. Vivian looked at her father. How was looking at her bracelet pocket. His face was doing something she had never seen it do. She would spend a long time afterward trying to name it, and the closest she would get was this. It was the face of a man who had built something for decades and was watching it become in front of his eyes a different thing than what he had intended to build. She did not feel triumph. She felt the specific exhausted gravity of a thing that was finally actually over, or rather not over, beginning. Because what came after an audit and a board vote, and a project freeze, and a father's silence was not a clean ending. It was the start of the long, unglamorous work of actually building something different from the rubble of what you had torn down. She knew that. She picked up her folder and her laptop and her water glass, and she walked out of the conference room, and she went to find a stairwell where she could stand alone for exactly 3 minutes before anyone needed her to be composed and certain again. In the stairwell, she leaned against the wall and pressed her palms flat against the cool concrete and breathed. Her phone buzzed again. Adrian. Sophie wants to know if you're coming to dinner Sunday. She's making pasta. I'm supervising. Both of those things are true. She read it twice. She typed back, tell her green. For the water molecules. Final answer. 3 seconds. She says she already changed it to green. Says she decided on her own. Vivian smiled at the concrete wall of a stairwell on the 28th floor of a building that was about to go through the most significant restructuring in its 30-year history. Sunday, she typed. I'll be there. She put the phone back in her pocket. She gave herself 2 more minutes. Then she pushed off the wall and walked back out to finish what she had started. The board voted to remove Richard Hartley as chairman on a Thursday morning 11 days after Vivian's presentation. She was not in the room when it happened. She had recused herself from that vote. Diane had advised it, and for once Vivian had taken advice without arguing, because some things needed to happen without her fingerprints on the final moment. Warren Holt called her at 10:47 a.m. and told her in the careful, neutral tone of a man delivering information that had significant weight on both sides. It was 8-3, Warren said. Effective immediately. He'll retain his shares but has no operational authority. Thank you, Warren. Vivian. A pause. This is going to be a difficult period. I want you to know that the board's confidence in your leadership is contingent on the restructuring proceeding as presented. There will be oversight. I know. I welcome it. A pause that suggested Warren had not expected that answer. All right, he said. We'll talk Monday. She put the phone down and sat at her desk for a long time without moving. She had imagined this moment in various forms over the past 2 weeks. She had imagined feeling relief or vindication, or the clean satisfaction of a thing resolved. What she actually felt was something more complicated and less comfortable. The weight of what came next, pressing down on her before the weight of what just happened, had fully lifted. Her father had not called. She had not called him either. That silence between them had a shape she didn't know how to navigate yet, and she had made the deliberate decision to let it sit until she had the bandwidth to approach it without saying things she couldn't take back. That day had not arrived. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Adrian. Just 2 words. It's done. He replied in under a minute. How are you? She typed, I don't know yet. Ask me in a week. His reply took a little longer this time. Come over tonight. Sophie's been asking. I made chili. It's not dinner party chili, it's actual chili, so don't come expecting anything. She read it twice. She thought about the 47 things she needed to do before end of day. The press statement Diane was drafting. The call with 3 institutional investors who needed to be managed carefully. The HR review of the planning committee members whose emails had been in the audit report. She typed, what time? 6:30. Bring nothing. She'll tell you that herself when you arrive, but I'm warning you in advance. She put the phone down and went back to work. She brought bread anyway. Sophie accepted it with the specific graciousness of a child who had been told not to expect anything and was pleasantly renegotiating the terms in real time. The press got the story 4 days later. Not the version Vivian would have chosen, not the version that came from her communications team's carefully drafted statement, but the other version, the one that started on a local news blog and moved fast. The way things moved fast. Now picking up detail and momentum with each share until by Wednesday morning, it was on 3 major news sites, and her phone had not stopped vibrating since 6 a.m. The headline that did the most damage was not about the audit. It was about Adrian. Contractor at center of Hartley CEO drama has troubled past, sources say. She read it standing in her kitchen in her robe at 6:15 in the morning, and the anger that moved through her was cold and specific, and nothing like the hot, reactive anger she had learned to suppress over years of difficult meetings. This was the kind of anger that settled into your bones and stayed there and made you very, very precise. The article was careful in the way that damaging articles are careful. It didn't accuse Adrian of anything directly. It referenced questions raised in the past about his character. The old theft rumor resurfaced and dressed in new language contextualized, with the implication that a man from his background, who had positioned himself close to a wealthy CEO, was a pattern worth noting. There was a quote from an unnamed source describing him as opportunistic. There was a reference to the pool incident framed as a chance encounter that has since developed into a personal relationship, raising questions about the CEO's judgment. It did not name her father as a source. It did not need to. She called Adrian immediately. He picked up on the first ring. He had already seen it. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine." His voice was flat in the way she had come to understand, meant the opposite, not dishonest, but contained the way a man contains something when he has had years of practice containing things. "Sophie doesn't read the news. I'll deal with it." "Your clients. I got a call this morning from Brennan Construction. They're reviewing our contract." A pause. "Second call I've gotten." "Adrian." "I knew this was a possibility." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew when I agreed to be involved in any of this that there would be a version of the story that went this direction. I calculated that. I made the choice." "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No, it doesn't." His voice was still flat, but something underneath it had shifted, something she could hear now, because she had been listening to him long enough to know the difference between his genuine calm and his constructed calm. "What I want to know is whether it came from your company." The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. "No," she said. "It didn't." "You're sure?" "I'm sure. I know where it came from." She paused. "I'm going to deal with it. Vivienne." His voice changed, sharper now. "Don't do anything that turns this into more of a public situation than it already is." Sophie had 2 kids ask her about it at school this morning. 2 kids whose parents apparently read the news at breakfast. She's 7 years old, and she handled it better than most adults I know, but she shouldn't have to handle it at all. She felt that land in a very specific place in her chest. What did she say to the kids? A brief silence. Then, despite everything, she said her dad was a good electrician, and people who didn't know what they were talking about should learn to read something better. She said that, word for word, "I don't know whether to be proud or terrified." "Both," Vivienne said. "Definitely both." The moment of lightness passed quickly. "I'm going to make a statement," she said. "On the record, today, my name, not a communications team." What kind of statement? The true kind. She was already thinking through the language. "I'm going to name the source of the original theft rumor. I'm going to name who had the bracelet and why the story was allowed to stand. I'm going to put Adrian Brooks' name in the same sentence as the words saved my life and falsely accused, and I'm going to put my father's name in the same sentence as the words chose not to correct the record." Silence on the other end. "You're going to put your father's name in a public statement. He put yours in a rumor for 17 years. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and shape and required both of them to simply be in it for a moment. "I don't want to be a story," he said, finally, quietly. "I told you that at the beginning." "I know. But I also—" He stopped, started again. "My mother has been calling me since 6 a.m. 3 of the families from her building called her. Roy Halladay drove to her apartment this morning to check on her because he saw the article." Another pause. "These people have been patient through this whole process. They've trusted that something different is actually going to happen this time. The last thing they need is for the person at the center of this to look like he was leveraging a personal relationship for access. How wasn't? I know that. You know that. The article doesn't say that." "Then we correct it," she said. "Publicly. Today. With my name on it." She heard him breathe. She heard in the background Sophie's voice. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. The tone of a child who was about to leave for school and wanted her father's attention before she went. "Let me call you back in an hour," he said. "Okay. Vivienne." A pause. "Be careful how you do it. Not for my sake. For yours." She understood what he meant. A statement that looked like a CEO defending a personal relationship to protect her own image was a different thing from a statement that told the truth, because the truth was the only defensible position. The line between them was real, and the public was practiced at finding it. "I know," she said. "I'll be careful." The statement went out at noon. She wrote it herself. Diane reviewed it for legal exposure. Marcus, who had been walking on eggshells around her since the board meeting, read it and said very carefully, "This is going to generate significant coverage," which was his way of saying it was going to be loud and not entirely the good kind of loud. "Good," Vivian said. "That's the point." The statement was 4 paragraphs. It named Adrian by name and identified him as the person who had pulled her from a flooded vehicle at the age of 11. It stated plainly that a piece of her jewelry had been in her father's possession following the rescue, and that the theft rumor had been allowed to stand without correction by her family. It used the words false accusation and deliberate omission in the same sentence. It also stated that Adrian Brooks had no involvement in any business decisions at Hartley Development, that his only role in recent events was as an independent contractor who had reported a legitimate safety hazard that was ignored, and ignoring that had contributed directly to the pool accident, and that the suggestion that he had positioned himself near her for personal gain was not only false, but consistent with the same pattern of reputation damage that her family had allowed to be done to him 17 years earlier. The last paragraph was the one she had rewritten 7 times. "I am not writing this to rehabilitate my company's image or to manage a news cycle. I am writing it because Adrian Brooks was 17 years old when he kept me alive, and the least I can do 17 years late is say his name correctly and make sure the record reflects what actually happened. What my family did to his reputation was wrong. What this article has done is the same wrong dressed in new language. He deserves better than both." By 2 p.m. it had been shared 40,000 times. By 4 p.m. 2 of the 3 news outlets that had run the original article had updated their stories with her statement included. By 5 p.m. Adrian called her. "Roy Halladay just brought my mother flowers," he said. "She's acting like it's not a big deal, and she has been crying for 45 minutes. Vivian felt something loosen in her chest. "Is she okay?" She's okay." His voice was different now. Not the flat containment of the morning, something more open underneath it, like a window that had been stuck and had finally been pushed up. "Vivian." "Yeah. Thank you." She knew from the way he said it that this was not a simple thing for him to say. Not because he was ungrateful. She had never once thought Adrian Brooks was ungrateful, but because he was a man who had spent a very long time not needing things from people, not asking for things from people, because the experience of needing something and not getting it had been thorough enough and early enough to reshape the whole architecture of how he moved through the world. Thank you from him meant something that would have taken 10 sentences from anyone else. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I know I don't have to." A pause. "I'm doing it anyway." The community planning meetings started 3 weeks later. Vivian had proposed them. Adrian had agreed to participate only after negotiating in writing in a document she had not expected but had signed without objection a set of non-negotiable conditions. Independent facilitator, not employed by Hartley Development. All proposed changes to be presented to residents before any board approval. Written guarantees of affordable housing preservation to be embedded in the development agreement, not the press materials. Local contractors to have genuine access to the bid process assessed on merit. And an independent safety inspection on every phase of construction conducted by a firm with no prior relationship to the company. She had signed all of it. The first meeting was held in the community room of Crestwood Commons. 47 people showed up. Vivian sat at a table not at the front of the room. An independent urban planning consultant named Patricia Webb ran the meeting. Vivian spoke twice when directly asked and listened for 2 hours. It was one of the hardest things she had done in her professional life, not because the people were hostile, though some were, and with full justification, and she had prepared herself for that and held steady through it, but because sitting in a room and listening genuinely, listening without preparing her response while the other person was still talking, without steering the conversation toward a resolution she had already architected. That was a muscle she had never been required to develop, and it ached in the specific way that unused muscles ache when you first ask them to work. Adrian sat across the room from her. He didn't look at her often, but when he did, it was with an expression she was learning to read, the watchful, assessing look of a man who was deciding on an ongoing basis whether the thing happening in front of him was real. After the meeting, when most people had filed out and Patricia was packing up her materials, Roy Halladay stopped beside Vivian's chair. "You want to know what would make a difference," he said. "Yes. Not the affordable units, not the compensation package, though both of those matter." He looked at her directly. "Come back. Next meeting and the one after that. Don't send a representative. Come yourself. That's what makes a difference." She nodded. "I will." He looked at her for a moment, the same assessing look she was becoming familiar with from everyone in this building. A look that had been earned by a long history of being told things that turned out not to be true. "All right," he said, and walked out. Adrian was waiting by the door. They walked out together into the warm evening, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She had come to appreciate that about him, that he didn't fill silences automatically, that he let things sit until there was something worth saying into them. "Roy's right," Adrian said, "about coming back. I know. It's going to take a long time. People here have been promised things before." "I know that too." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When this is done, when the redesign is built, and the meetings are finished, and the company is stable again, what do you want?" She looked at him. It was a question she had been asking herself in various forms for weeks, in the quiet hours before sleep, in the car, on the way to meetings, in the stairwell on the 28th floor. What do you want, Vivian? Not what do you need to do next. Not what does the situation require. What do you actually want? "I want to build something I don't have to be ashamed of," she said. "Something that's actually good, not good for a development company, actually good." She paused. "And I want—" She stopped. "Say it." She looked at him standing in the warm Charleston evening with his hands in his pockets and his steady, unhurried patience, and she said the true thing. "I want to keep doing this, whatever this is. I want to keep showing up and having you tell me when I'm wrong, and sitting at your kitchen table and watching Sophie explain water filtration to strangers." She held his gaze. "I know that's not a clean proposal. I know I don't have the right to expect anything. I know that what I'm asking you to consider involves trusting someone who comes with a significant amount of complicated history attached." She paused. I want you to know that I'm not here because I owe you. I'm here because I want to be here." Adrian looked at her for a long time. "I have a rule," he said finally, "about Sophie. Nobody comes into her life temporarily. The second she attaches to someone, they're accountable to her, not just to me." He held her gaze. "She's already attached to you. I watched it happen at the science fair, and I let it happen, which means I already made a decision. He paused. "I needed to hear you say it like that, out loud, without any scaffolding around it." "That's the whole thing," she said. "No scaffolding." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sunday dinners are non-negotiable. Sophie picks the menu. It's usually pasta or tacos, and occasionally a request for breakfast food at 6 p.m. that I'm still negotiating." Vivian felt something move in her chest that she was going to stop trying to name and simply allow to be there. "I can work with that," she said, "and I'm going to keep telling you when you're wrong. I'm counting on it." He looked at her steadily. "And you're going to keep listening." "That one's harder," she said. "But yes." Something in his face, the last of the careful managed distance, came the rest of the way down. Not dramatically, not all at once, just gone. Like a door that had been sitting almost closed for a long time and had finally quietly been allowed to open. He didn't reach for her hand. She didn't reach for his. They just stood there in the evening with the knowledge of what had just been said sitting between them, which was enough, which was more than enough. Which was, she understood exactly the right pace for two people who had both learned the hard way that moving too fast was how you built things that couldn't hold their own weight. "Walk back to your car," he said. "Yeah," she said. "Let's walk." Her father called on a Sunday. She almost didn't pick up. She was at Adrian's kitchen table with Sophie, showing her the revised science fair poster. Green water molecules, purple background. A compromise that Sophie had negotiated with the same calm tenacity she apparently brought to everything, and her phone buzzed on the counter, and she saw the name, and her whole body made a decision before her mind caught up with it. She picked it up. "I'll be right back," she told Sophie, and stepped out onto the small back porch. "Vivian." Her father's voice was different. The mahogany smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had changed the structural confidence, the absolute bedrock certainty she had grown up mistaking for wisdom. It was still there, but cracked, not broken. Cracked. "Dad, I've been thinking about what to say." A pause. Long enough that she didn't feel it. "It's the board decision was fair. I want you to know I understand that." She waited. "The bracelet." Another pause. "I told myself at the time that I was protecting you, that dragging you into a complicated situation with a boy whose father had there were complications. I told myself the kindest thing was to let it settle quietly." "You told yourself a lot of things," she said. "Not cruelly, precisely." "Yes." His voice was very quiet now. "I did." She looked out at the small yard. A bird feeder that Sophie had built from a kit slightly lopsided, extremely functional. A garden hose coiled neatly. The ordinary taken care of details of a life that ran on the love of a man who had started with nothing and built something real. "I'm not ready to have the full conversation," she said. "I want you to know I'm not done being angry, but I also want you to know that I—" She stopped, took a breath. "You built something. Whatever it became, you built something. And I learned from that. I learned how to build. I just had to learn how to build it differently." A long silence. "Are you happy?" he said. It came out plainly, more plainly than she'd ever heard him speak, stripped of strategy and management, and the habitual control of every room he was in. "With your choices, are you happy?" She looked back through the glass door at Sophie, who was now apparently explaining the water cycle to Adrian, who was listening with the patient attention of a man who had heard the water cycle explained many times and found it no less worth listening to. "I'm getting there," she said. "Yeah." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "That's—" A pause. "Good." It was not a resolution. It was not forgiveness granted or a relationship rebuilt. It was two words from a complicated man who was beginning very slowly and very late the process of understanding what he had done. It was the first brick, not the building. She understood that. She accepted it. "I'll call you next week," she said. "We'll talk." She went back inside. Sophie looked up from the poster. "Was that important?" "Yes." "Is everything okay?" Vivian sat back down at the table. "Getting there," she said. "Yeah." Sophie considered this with great seriousness, decided it was an acceptable answer, and turned back to her poster. Adrian across the table caught her eye. He said nothing. He just looked at her with the steady, unhurried certainty of a man who had made his decision and was not second-guessing it. She looked back. Outside, the Charleston evening was coming in warm through the kitchen window. Somewhere down the street someone was mowing a lawn. The pasta water on the stove had started to boil. Sophie said, "Okay, but I need someone to tell me if the arrows are going the right direction, because Dad keeps saying they're fine, but he says that about everything." "Let me see," Vivian said, and she leaned in, and she looked, and the arrows were going exactly the right direction, and she said so, and Sophie made the specific sound of a child who has been vindicated, and Adrian leaned back in his chair with his coffee, and the quiet expression of a man who was improbably and completely exactly where he wanted to be. 18 months is a long time when you're counting days. It's nothing at all when you're looking back. Vivian understood this on a Saturday morning in early October, standing at the edge of a public pool that had not existed 14 months ago, watching Sophie argue with a teenage lifeguard about whether her swimming form was technically correct or merely excellent, and thinking about the version of herself who had stood at the edge of a different pool on a different October night, and believed that the most important thing in the room was a $340 million architectural rendering on a backlit wall. That woman felt very far away, not gone. Vivian was not sentimental enough to pretend that a person could be scraped clean of what they had been and become something entirely new. The drive was still there. The precision, the early mornings, the habit of reading a room the second she walked into it, and knowing before she sat down who held the real power and what they were afraid of. Those things didn't go away. She had stopped wanting them to. What had changed was what she aimed them at: the Harbor Light community. The name had come from a resident vote, which Diane Chen had watched with polite bewilderment, and Roy Halladay had watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular kind of meeting, had opened its first residential buildings 8 weeks ago. 212 units. 60% market rate, 40% income restricted embedded in the development agreement in language that had been reviewed by 3 separate housing advocacy organizations and could not be amended without a 2/3 resident council vote. The ground floor of Building 1 was a daycare center that had a 6-month wait list already. Building 3 had a technical training center on its 2nd floor. Adrian had been involved in its design from the beginning. Not as a favor, not as a concession, but because he knew things about how tradespeople actually learned and what they actually needed that no one else in the planning process did. The program enrolled its first cohort of 22 apprentices 3 months ago. 12 of them were single parents. 4 were under 25 and had backgrounds that would have, in a different version of this city, made them invisible to the kind of opportunity that was sitting right in front of them now. Brooks Electrical had won 3 contracts within the Harbor Light development. Open bid process, highest safety rating, 3rd lowest cost. Adrian had called her the morning the results came in, and she had heard in his voice something she hadn't heard there before. Not relief, not gratitude, but the clean and uncomplicated satisfaction of a man whose work had been measured on its actual merits and had come back exactly as he knew it would. Fair process produces fair results, he said. Novel concept, she said. You should try it more often. I'm working on it. She was. The company was different now, not unrecognizable, not perfectly reformed, not the subject of a flattering documentary about corporate redemption that she had already declined twice. Different in the way that organizations change when the people at the top stop protecting the wrong things. Slower than she would have liked in some places. Faster than she expected in others. Diane Chen had become the company's first Chief Accountability Officer, a title that Marcus Webb had initially responded to with visible discomfort and then grudgingly with respect. Once he understood that accountability had a positive business case when your alternative was federal investigation. 2 of the planning executives whose emails had been in the audit report were gone. 3 others had been retrained with the specific and somewhat humbling experience of sitting in a room with housing advocates and listening to what their decisions had actually produced on the ground. The board had retained Vivian, under oversight that was real and not ceremonial, and which she had welcomed rather than negotiated against, because she had understood by then that the oversight was not a punishment. It was the structure that made the work possible. Her father had not returned to a formal role. He and Vivian had lunch once a month now at a restaurant in the French Quarter that he had chosen and she had not objected to because it was good food and neutral ground. The lunches were not easy, and she did not pretend they were. They were 2 people working at something that had been broken for longer than either of them had been willing to say out loud, and working at something broken was slow and sometimes painful, and required showing up even when you didn't feel like it. She showed up. He showed up. That was not nothing. Sophie had learned to swim in June. This had been her own decision, announced at a Sunday dinner with the particular finality of a child who had made up her mind and was informing the relevant adults rather than consulting them. She wanted to swim. She had found a program at the community center. She needed someone to drive her on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Adrian had looked at Vivian across the dinner table and said nothing, but his expression had said, "This is going to become relevant to you specifically in approximately 30 seconds. It had taken 20. "Will you come?" Sophie said, looking at Vivian. "To the lessons. Dad comes, but he doesn't swim. I want someone to swim with me after." Vivian had looked at the pasta on her plate. She had looked at Sophie's face, open, expectant, completely unaware that she had just placed a very specific thing on the table that had nothing to do with swimming. I'll come to the lessons, Vivian said, and swim after a pause. We'll see, Vivian said. Sophie's expression made it clear that we'll see was being logged as a provisional yes, and she intended to collect on it. She had in fact collected on it. In August. 8 weeks into Sophie's lessons on a Tuesday evening, when the community center pool was warm and nearly empty, and Sophie had just demonstrated a very credible freestyle stroke to her instructor, and turned around in the water, looking for someone to confirm that it had been excellent. Vivian had been sitting in the bleachers. Sophie had waved at her with the insistence of someone who was not going to accept sitting in the bleachers as a permanent condition. Vivian had looked at the water. She had been afraid of it for 20 years. Not a screaming fear, not a fear that controlled her daily life, but a constant low-grade avoidance, a careful and never-examined habit of staying at the edge of things and calling it preference. She had put her feet in. Adrian had appeared beside her without fanfare, sat down at the edge of the pool, feet in the water. "You don't have to," he said. "I know. She's not going to love you less if you don't. I know that too." She sat there for a moment with the water around her ankles. "The first time," she said. "In the creek. What was it like swimming in the dark in moving water?" "Terrifying," he said. He was not a man who dressed up the truth. "The current was stronger than I expected. I couldn't see the bottom. I didn't know how deep it was." "But you went in anyway." "You were in there." She sat with that. "I'm not asking you to go in for me," he said. "I want to be clear about that. This is your decision. Your water." "My water," she said. She slid in. The shock of it, even warm, even controlled, even in a brightly lit pool with a lifeguard 15 feet away, and Sophie immediately swimming toward her with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever who has just spotted a favorite person. The shock of it was real. The old fear was real. The pressure in her chest, the instinct to get out the voice that sounded like it was coming from very far back in time. She let it be there. She breathed through it. She stood in the shallow end with the water at her waist, and felt her heart rate, and let it do what it was going to do, and did not make it mean anything other than what it was, a body remembering something, and a person choosing in full awareness of that memory to stay in the water anyway. Sophie reached her and grabbed her hand. "You're in," she said with great satisfaction. "I'm in," Vivian said. "Come on, I'll show you the part where you float on your back. It's easy. You just have to stop trying to be in charge of everything." Adrian, still sitting at the pool's edge, made no comment. But she could hear from where she was standing that he was smiling. The Harbor Light Community Center opened on a Friday. Vivian had not planned it as a big event. She had specifically asked Patricia Webb, who was now the community liaison for the project, to keep it local residents, the planning council, the training program's first cohort, the businesses that had signed leases on the ground floor retail. Not a press event. Not a ribbon cutting with politicians who had not been involved in the work and would not be involved in what came next. Patricia had said, "You understand that the press is going to show up anyway." "Let them stand outside," Vivian said. "They can report on what they see. They don't get a seat at the table we set." Patricia had smiled the smile of a woman who approved. The morning of the opening, Vivian was at Crestwood Commons at 7 a.m., not at the new development. At the old building where Gloria Brooks was finishing her coffee in apartment 14C before the movers arrived to help her into her new unit in Building 2. Gloria had refused to move early, had stayed in 14C until the last possible day, in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with principle. She was going to live in her home until her home was ready to receive her, and not a day before. Vivian knocked on the door of 14C for what she already knew was the last time. Gloria opened it in her house shoes and looked at her. "You didn't have to come this early." "I wanted to." Gloria looked at her for a moment with those direct measuring eyes that had seen everything clearly from the first morning Vivian had shown up at this building with a document folder and a complicated conscience. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." There was always coffee. They sat at the table, the same table where Vivian had sat on her second day in this building when Gloria had asked her, What are you going to do about my building? With a directness that had rearranged something in Vivian's understanding of what the situation actually required. The apartment was mostly packed. Boxes stacked with the same thorough system she brought to everything. The photographs were the last things down, wrapped carefully, waiting on the counter. 19 years, Vivian said. 19 years and 4 months. Gloria wrapped both hands around her mug. I cried when I moved in, you know. I had just gone back to work after Marcus. That's Adrian's father. I had just gone back and we couldn't afford much, and this place was what we could afford, and I walked in and I thought, this is not what I imagined. She looked around the empty walls. And then it became what I couldn't imagine leaving. Your new place is good, Vivian said. I've been in it. The light is better. I know. I've been in it too. A pause. It's not about the light. No. It's about what you built here. Gloria looked at her. Not the building. What you build in a place. The life. She picked up her mug. You can build it again, though. That's what I keep telling myself. You build it once you know how to build it. The second time is different, but different isn't worse. Vivian thought about a version of herself in a hotel suite a year and a half ago, not sleeping, running searches in newspaper archives, finding a name she hadn't known she was looking for. I've been thinking about that, she said, about what gets built and how. And I think I spent a long time building the right things for the wrong reasons. Building to prove something. Building so fast I didn't look at what I was standing on. She looked at her coffee. I'm trying to build slower. Gloria nodded. My son, she said, has spent a long time building walls because he needed them. He built them carefully, and they're good walls. She looked at Vivian steadily. He's been taking some of them down. I want you to know that I see that. And I want you to know that if you're the reason... She stopped. I'm not a sentimental woman. I know. I'm just saying. He's different. And I think you know what I mean. Vivian knew exactly what she meant. He's the reason I'm different too, she said. It goes both directions. Gloria considered this for a long moment. Then she stood up, picked up the photographs from the counter, and handed them to Vivian. Carry these for me, she said. My hands are full. The community center opening was everything she had wanted it to be, which was to say it was completely ordinary in the best possible way. Roy Halladay gave a 3-minute speech that was more honest than most speeches twice the length. Mrs. Patterson, who was 81 and had no patience for ceremony, ate 2 pieces of the sheet cake that someone had brought and declared the daycare center's mural acceptable considering. The first cohort of apprentices from the training program showed up in their Brooks Electrical work shirts. Adrian had not asked them to. They had done it on their own and stood in a cluster near the technical center entrance with the particular pride of people who are at the beginning of something real. Sophie wore her good dress and spent 45 minutes giving self-appointed tours of the community pool to anyone who would follow her, narrating the filtration system with the authority of someone who had been thinking about water quality since 2nd grade and considered herself something of an expert. She was not wrong. Vivian moved through the morning the way she had learned to move through the community events over the last 18 months, present, listening, not managing. It had taken work. It still took work. There was a version of her that would always want to stand at the front of the room and steer the narrative toward the outcome she had designed. She had learned to recognize that version and make a different choice. In the early afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and Sophie had been retrieved from the pool area by a lifeguard who had very politely suggested that the tour program might benefit from a brief intermission, Vivian found Adrian standing near the edge of the community center's outdoor terrace, looking out at the waterfront. It was a good view. She had spent a lot of time 18 months ago thinking about how to make it a view that belonged to wealthy people, paying premium prices for the privilege of looking at it. It was a better view now. She stood beside him. Roy told me the retail spaces are 90% leased, she said. Local businesses, all of them. I heard. The training program has a wait list for the 2nd cohort. I know. I've been reviewing the applications with Patricia. A pause. There's a kid, 22 years old, single dad, grew up in Crestwood. Applied to be an apprentice. His application said he knew this neighborhood and wanted to build the kind of work record that would let him stay in it. He was quiet for a moment. I approved him before I finished reading the second paragraph. She looked at his profile. The jaw she had once read as stubbornness and now read as something more accurate, the face of a man who did not move easily, but when he moved without question. Adrian. He turned. When you pulled me out of that water, she said, 17 years ago, did you know that it was going to matter this much? He looked at her with the steady patience she had come to understand was not absence of feeling, but the opposite. The particular quality of a person who felt things so specifically that they had learned to take their time with them. I knew you were drowning, he said. That was enough. She looked at him for a long moment. It wasn't enough for me, she said. Not for a long time. I needed it to be a story I could resolve, a debt I could calculate, something with an ending. She paused. It took me a while to understand that some things don't end. They just change shape. They become something you carry differently. He reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not as a gesture. Just reached over, found her hand, and held it the way you hold something you've decided to keep. Sophie wants a dog, he said. She blinked. What? She's been building a case for 6 weeks. She has a PowerPoint, an actual PowerPoint with slides. He looked back at the waterfront. She asked me if you would be part of the decision. Something moved through Vivian's chest, warm and specific, and beyond her ability to name without underselling it. She asked you that. She said, and I'm quoting directly, if Vivian is going to be here all the time, she should get a vote on the dog. A pause. I told her we'd discuss it. Are you discussing it with me now? I'm telling you that the discussion is going to happen, and you should have a position prepared. She's thorough. You've seen the water filtration poster. I like dogs, Vivian said. Good to know. Adrian. He looked at her. What she said. She kept her voice steady. She had learned slowly, and not without difficulty, to say the true thing without scaffolding around it. That I'm going to be here all the time. Yeah. Is that what you want? He looked at her with the direct, unhurried certainty of a man who had made his decision a long time ago, and had simply been waiting for the moment to say it plainly. Vivian, he said, I pulled you out of the water when you were 11 years old, and I didn't know why it would matter. I let you into my house when you showed up at 7 in the morning with a printed newspaper article, and I didn't know why I did that either. He held her gaze. I know why now. Yeah, I want you here, all the time. That's what I want. She squeezed his hand. Behind them. Sophie appeared from around the corner of the terrace, with the timing of a child who had been waiting for the right moment and had judged it correctly. Are you guys done with the serious talking? She said. Because the cake is almost gone, and I saved you both a piece, but I can't promise anything if you wait much longer. Adrian turned to her. You saved cake. I'm very responsible. You ate 3 pieces. I saved these 2 after the 3. She looked between them with the bright, assessing eyes of a child who had absorbed everything and drawn her own conclusions and was completely at peace with them. Also, I told Mrs. Patterson you'd take a photo with her by the pool because she said she wanted proof that the CEO got in the water voluntarily. Those were her exact words. Voluntarily. Vivian laughed, a real one, the kind that started somewhere behind the sternum, and didn't ask permission. Tell Mrs. Patterson I'll be right there, she said. Sophie disappeared back around the corner at a run. Adrian looked at Vivian. Ready. She thought about all the things she was walking into. The ongoing oversight. The second phase of the development. The lunch next month with her father. The dog conversation that was coming whether she was prepared or not. The daily, unglamorous work of being a person who had learned late and at significant cost that the right things and the easy things were rarely the same, and had decided to keep choosing the right ones anyway. She thought about a flooded car and a dark creek and a teenage boy who went into the water because she was in it. She thought about a swimming pool and a crescent-shaped scar and 4 words that had unlocked 17 years of silence. She thought about Sophie's hand in hers on the first day she had stood in the shallow end and let the fear be there without letting it be in charge. Yeah, she said, Ready. They walked back into the community center together, into the noise and the cake, and the ordinary, extraordinary evidence of what happens when people decide to build something true. And Vivian Hartley, who had once believed that the most important thing she could offer the world was a $340 million skyline, walked forward into a life that could not be measured in millions or rendered on a backlit wall, and understood completely and without reservation that she had never built anything better.